In the autumn of 1962, 12 American Green Berets stepped off a transport aircraft onto the humid tarmac of RAF Changi. The air hit them like a wet blanket the moment the aircraft door opened. For men who had already served in Southeast Asia, humidity was nothing new, but Singapore in October had a way of making even experienced soldiers feel like they had stepped inside a steaming engine room. They were not ordinary soldiers. Each man had been selected from the 5th Special Forces Group, a unit already gaining a reputation for operating where conventional forces could not. Some of them had spent months advising South Vietnamese troops along the muddy waterways of the Mekong Delta. They had walked through villages where the air smelled of fish sauce and diesel fuel, where every tree line might hide a sniper and every farmer might secretly carry information to the enemy. By the standards of Special Forces soldiers, they were already seasoned. But the assignment waiting for them in Singapore seemed strangely calm compared to the war zones they knew. Officially, they had been sent to attend a 6-week jungle warfare course run by the British Army. Unofficially, many of them believed it was little more than a professional courtesy between allies. The British had invited them, Washington had agreed, and so a dozen Green Berets were temporarily pulled from their advisory roles in Vietnam and flown south. Waiting for them on the runway was not a ceremony, not a welcoming speech, and not even a proper briefing. Instead, a battered Bedford military truck rattled nearby, its paint faded by tropical sun. A British sergeant leaning against the vehicle simply looked at the Americans and said a few quiet words. Right then, bags in the back. No speeches, no introductions. The Green Berets tossed their duffel bags into the truck and climbed aboard. The road north from Singapore into the jungles of southern Malaya was long, narrow, and lined with dense green walls of vegetation. The truck bounced along uneven pavement while the soldiers watched the landscape change. City streets faded behind them. Concrete gave way to jungle. The deeper they drove, the darker the forest seemed to become. Towering dipterocarp trees rose hundreds of feet into the air. Thick vines hung between branches like cables. The ground below was tangled with roots, mud, and thick undergrowth that swallowed sunlight before it could reach the forest floor. Some of the Americans had seen jungle before, but this jungle felt different. It felt older. After nearly 2 hours of driving, the truck finally turned off the main road and rolled down a narrow dirt track toward a cluster of simple wooden buildings surrounded by forest. This was the Far East Land Forces Jungle Warfare School. The place looked less like a military base and more like a logging camp that had been abandoned and then quietly taken over by soldiers. A few wooden huts stood on stilts. Corrugated metal roofs reflected the dull gray sky. Laundry hung from lines between the buildings, slowly drying in the thick tropical air. Standing near the main hut were several British soldiers. They wore faded jungle uniforms that looked almost bleached by the sun and rain. Their boots were covered in layers of dried mud. Their sleeves were rolled high, revealing arms scarred by insects and branches. One of them stepped forward. He did not introduce himself as a commander or instructor. He simply said he was from the Special Air Service. To the Americans, that name carried weight. The SAS had built a reputation during the Second World War for daring raids behind enemy lines in North Africa and Europe. But their most recent experience was something even more relevant. For over a decade, British forces had fought communist guerrillas during the Malayan Emergency. It had been a brutal jungle war, fought against an enemy that rarely appeared in open battle. The insurgents hid in dense rainforest. They moved quietly along narrow jungle trails. They attacked quickly and disappeared before regular troops could respond. The British had been forced to learn how to fight in that environment, painfully, slowly, and sometimes fatally. The jungle had been their harshest instructor. By 1962, the lessons learned during that long campaign had been distilled into training programs designed to prepare soldiers for the exact kind of war that was now spreading across Southeast Asia. The Americans believed they understood jungle warfare. After all, they had already served in Vietnam. But the British instructors did not seem impressed by that fact. The first evening was quiet. No dramatic speeches were given, no orientation briefings lasted for hours. Instead, the Americans were handed basic instructions. Tomorrow, they would enter the jungle. Not for a short exercise, for days. The Green Berets laughed among themselves that night. To them, jungle patrols were nothing new. They had already conducted operations in areas where leeches clung to your legs and mosquitoes attacked in clouds thick enough to darken the air. One of the Americans reportedly joked that the course might feel like a vacation compared to Vietnam. But the next morning, something small began to change their confidence. The British instructors issued equipment lists. The Americans expected standard field gear, radios, extra ammunition, rations, maybe heavy packs. Instead, the lists were surprisingly minimal. A machete, a rifle, a small ration pack, a poncho, a compass, and that was nearly it. One of the Americans asked where the rest of the equipment was. The British instructor shrugged. If you can't carry it through the jungle quietly, you don't need it. That answer produced a few skeptical smiles. The Americans were used to operating with technology, radios, supply lines, and firepower when needed. But the British philosophy appeared very different. To them, survival in the jungle depended on something else entirely: silence, patience, and understanding the forest itself. Later that morning, the Americans watched as one SAS instructor demonstrated something that seemed almost impossible. He stepped off the dirt path and disappeared into the jungle. Not running, not crawling, simply walking slowly. Within seconds, he was gone. The thick vegetation swallowed him completely. The leaves barely moved, no branches snapped, no sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. The Americans stared at the spot where he had vanished. One of them finally muttered a quiet sentence that would later be remembered by several men in the group. "If the enemy can do that," he said, "we're in trouble." Minutes later, the instructor reappeared several meters behind them. None of them had heard him move. In that moment, the 12 Green Berets began to realize something unsettling. The British were not teaching them how to survive the jungle. They were teaching them to become part of it. And the course had not even truly begun yet.
The first patrol into the jungle began before sunrise. The air was still cool, but the humidity already clung to the skin like a thin layer of oil. The 12 American Green Berets gathered near the edge of the tree line, while several British instructors from the Special Air Service checked their gear with quiet efficiency. There were no long briefings, no dramatic speeches about survival. One of the instructors simply pointed into the wall of vegetation ahead and said, "That's where you're going." From the outside, the jungle looked almost peaceful. A sea of green leaves, tall trees swaying slightly in the morning air, birds calling somewhere high in the canopy. But the moment the patrol stepped off the narrow path and into the forest, the environment changed completely. The ground was soft and uneven. Thick roots twisted across the soil like natural traps. Every step had to be placed carefully, or a man could easily twist an ankle. The undergrowth pressed against their bodies as they moved forward, forcing them to push through layers of vines and branches. Within minutes, the Americans were sweating heavily. The jungle heat did not behave like desert heat. There was no wind to cool the skin, no dry air to carry away sweat. Instead, the humidity trapped every drop of moisture against the body. Shirts soaked through almost immediately. One of the SAS instructors turned around and held up a hand, stopping the patrol. "Too loud," he said quietly. The Americans looked confused. No one had spoken. No one had fired a weapon. But the instructor pointed toward the ground. One of the soldiers had stepped on a dry branch. It had snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. In a normal environment, the sound would have meant nothing. In the jungle, it meant everything. The instructor explained that in dense rainforest, sound travels in strange ways. A small noise close by can carry dozens of meters through the vegetation. Guerrilla fighters who grow up in these forests can recognize those sounds instantly. A broken twig, a boot scraping bark, even the rhythm of footsteps. To them, those noises were like a signal flare. The patrol began moving again, but this time the pace was painfully slow. Each step was deliberate, each movement carefully controlled. Sometimes the instructors stopped the entire group just to demonstrate how to push a branch aside without letting it snap back into place. At first, the Americans found it frustrating. They were trained fighters, accustomed to moving with confidence. Yet here they were, learning to walk through the jungle like beginners. But the lessons quickly became more serious. After an hour of slow movement, the instructor halted again and crouched near the ground. He pointed to a small mark in the mud beside a narrow animal trail. At first, the Americans saw nothing unusual, but when they leaned closer, they noticed the faint outline of a boot print. The soil was slightly compressed. A few leaves had been disturbed. It was the kind of detail most soldiers would overlook completely. The instructor explained that during the long years of fighting communist guerrillas in Malaya, British patrols had learned that the jungle always recorded movement. Every step left a trace. Broken moss, bent grass, disturbed insects. Tracks could tell you how many people had passed, how recently they had moved, and even the direction they were heading. These techniques had been refined during the long conflict known as the Malayan Emergency. For more than a decade, British soldiers had hunted insurgents who knew the jungle better than any map ever could. The only way to fight them was to read the forest like a book, and that required patience. The instructor stood up and looked at the Americans. "You think you're hunters," he said calmly. "But in the jungle, if you're careless, you're the ones being hunted." The words hung in the thick air. Later that day, the patrol moved deeper into terrain where the canopy became so dense that daylight turned green and dim. In some places, the jungle floor was nearly dark even at noon. Navigation suddenly became far more difficult. Compasses worked, of course, but the thick vegetation made it nearly impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Landmarks disappeared, paths twisted and vanished without warning. One SAS instructor demonstrated a technique that surprised the Americans. Instead of constantly checking the compass, he would pick a distant tree aligned with the correct bearing and move toward it. Once he reached it, he chose another marker further ahead. It was slow, but it kept the patrol moving in a straight line. The Americans realized that without this kind of discipline, a unit could easily wander in circles for hours without realizing it. Then came the rain. In the jungle, storms arrived without warning. One moment the air was still, the next moment the sky opened with a roar of water crashing through the canopy. Within seconds, the ground turned into slick mud. Streams formed where there had been dry soil only minutes before. The patrol stopped, while the instructors quickly rigged ponchos between trees to form makeshift shelters. But even under cover, the rain found ways to seep through. Boots filled with water, equipment became damp, mosquitoes appeared in thick clouds as the temperature dropped slightly in the downpour. One of the Americans asked how long the storm would last. The instructor looked up through the dripping leaves. "Could be 10 minutes, could be 3 hours," he said. The Green Berets waited in silence while the jungle thundered around them. For the first time since arriving in Malaya, some of them began to understand the true challenge of jungle warfare. The enemy was dangerous, but the environment itself was relentless. Heat drained your strength. Insects attacked constantly. Rain destroyed comfort and soaked equipment.
and the forest never stopped closing in around you. Later that evening, when the patrol finally returned to camp, the Americans were exhausted. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and rain. Their boots were caked with layers of thick mud. One of them reportedly sat down on a wooden bench outside the barracks and shook his head slowly. They had not fired a single shot that day. They had not faced an enemy, yet it had been one of the most physically demanding days of training many of them had ever experienced. What impressed them was not the difficulty, it was the attitude of the SAS instructors. The British soldiers moved through the jungle calmly, almost casually, as if the jungle were a familiar neighborhood rather than a hostile wilderness. To them, the jungle was not something to fight against, it was something to understand. And the Americans were beginning to realize that mastering that understanding might take far longer than 6 weeks.
By the second week, the jungle no longer felt like an unfamiliar environment. It felt like an opponent that never slept. The 12 Americans from the 5th Special Forces Group had already spent several long patrols moving through dense rainforest under the watchful eyes of instructors from the Special Air Service. Every day followed the same exhausting pattern. Hours of slow movement through tangled vegetation, constant observation drills, and lessons that often seemed simple at first, but quickly proved brutal in practice. But during the third phase of the course, the training changed. Until now, the instructors had focused on individual skills, how to move silently, how to read tracks in mud, how to navigate through thick forest where visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters. Now they began to teach something far more dangerous: jungle patrol warfare. Early one morning, the Americans were woken before sunrise. The sky above the camp was still dark, and the air carried the heavy smell of wet soil and decaying leaves. One of the British instructors gathered the group beside a crude wooden table covered with a rough map of the surrounding jungle. The mission sounded simple. A patrol would move 20 kilometers through dense terrain, establish an observation position overlooking a narrow jungle trail, and remain hidden for 2 days. No fires, no unnecessary movement, no radio transmissions unless absolutely necessary. The instructors explained that during the long years of fighting communist guerrillas in Malaya, British patrols had sometimes waited days just to confirm that a single enemy courier used a particular trail. Patience was the most valuable weapon in the jungle. The Americans began their march just after dawn. At first, the movement felt familiar. They followed the same slow pace they had practiced earlier in the course, stepping carefully over roots and avoiding loose branches that could snap underfoot. But after several hours, the exhaustion began to build. Humidity drained energy faster than most soldiers expected. Sweat soaked their uniforms until the fabric clung to their bodies. Mosquitoes followed them constantly, whining around their ears and biting any exposed skin. Then came the leeches. Small black worms clung to leaves and branches along the trail. When a patrol brushed against the vegetation, the creatures attached themselves silently to boots, socks, and skin. At first, the Americans barely noticed them. But during a short rest stop, one of the soldiers looked down and saw thin lines of blood running down his ankle. Several leeches had already attached themselves beneath his sock. The British instructor calmly showed them how to remove the parasites without tearing the skin. Then the patrol continued moving. Hours passed. The jungle grew thicker. In some areas, the vegetation became so dense that the soldiers had to cut narrow passages with their machetes. But even that had to be done carefully. Loud chopping noises could travel far through the forest. One instructor explained that experienced guerrillas could sometimes hear careless patrols from more than 100 meters away. Sound meant danger. By late afternoon, the patrol reached a narrow ridge overlooking a barely visible jungle trail. The path looked insignificant, little more than a faint line through the undergrowth.
but the instructors explained that such trails were the highways of guerrilla warfare. Small groups moved along them quietly, often carrying supplies, messages, or weapons between hidden camps. The Americans were ordered to establish an observation position. They built it slowly, using branches, leaves, and natural vegetation to conceal their presence. Within an hour, the small team had created a hidden position where they could watch the trail without being seen. Then came the hardest part: waiting. The jungle grew quiet as evening approached. The temperature dropped slightly, but the humidity remained heavy in the air. Insects chirped loudly in the undergrowth, while distant birds called from the treetops. The Americans took turns watching the trail through small gaps in the vegetation. Nothing moved. Hours passed. Night fell quickly beneath the thick canopy. Darkness in the jungle was almost absolute. Without moonlight filtering through the trees, visibility dropped to only a few meters. The men listened carefully for any sound that might reveal movement on the trail. But the jungle played tricks on the ears. Leaves rustled when small animals moved through the undergrowth. Branches creaked as the wind shifted high above the canopy. Sometimes distant noises echoed strangely through the forest, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. The instructors had warned them about this. In the jungle, imagination could become an enemy. By the second day, fatigue began to set in. Sleeping in the observation position was uncomfortable and restless. Mosquitoes attacked constantly, and every small noise in the forest seemed to demand attention. Yet the SAS instructors remained perfectly calm. They watched the trail patiently, barely moving. Late in the evening, something finally happened. One of the Americans spotted movement. A figure appeared briefly along the narrow trail, moving slowly, carefully, almost blending into the vegetation. Then another figure appeared behind him. 2 men. They were carrying rifles. The Americans froze. The instructors quietly signaled for silence. No one spoke. No one shifted position. The 2 figures moved along the trail for only a few seconds before disappearing into the jungle again. But the lesson was clear. The patrol had been sitting only 20 meters away. If they had been careless, if they had made noise, lit a fire, or moved too suddenly, their presence would have been revealed instantly. Later that evening, as the patrol quietly withdrew from the observation position, one of the Green Berets whispered something that several others would later remember. He said that in Vietnam, American units often relied on helicopters, artillery, and overwhelming firepower to control the battlefield. But here in the jungle, none of those advantages mattered. What mattered was patience, stealth, and discipline. The SAS instructors had spent years perfecting these methods during the Malayan Emergency. Now the Americans were beginning to see why those lessons had been so hard-earned. Because in the jungle, the soldier who moves first is often the soldier who dies first. By the 4th week of training, the American Green Berets had begun to change. The jungle no longer intimidated them in the same way, but it had forced them to understand their own limitations. Each day, the SAS instructors pushed them harder, not with brute force, but with subtle challenges that tested patience, observation, and endurance in ways no firefight ever could. One morning, the Americans were given an entirely new assignment, a mock ambush scenario. They were told they would move as a team along a narrow trail, while a small group of instructors would attempt to attack them from hidden positions. The goal was not to win the firefight, but to survive undetected, gather intelligence, and extract themselves quietly. The Americans laughed at first. They had faced ambushes in Vietnam where gunfire and explosives were the only language. How could a simulated attack without real bullets possibly be challenging? The answer became clear within the first 10 minutes. The trail wound through a valley of tall trees and thick undergrowth. Every step produced 1,000 small sounds: snapping twigs, rustling leaves, insects fleeing from disturbance. Each movement had to be deliberate. A single misstep could betray the entire team. The SAS instructors had scattered along the hillside, nearly invisible even to the trained eyes of the Green Berets. They did not fire blank rounds or create explosions. Instead, they relied on sound, shadow, and timing. A snapped branch here, a rustle there, a faint movement in the periphery. These were enough to make the Americans freeze, check their surroundings, and rethink every step. Hours passed. Sweat-soaked uniforms became uncomfortable, boots weighed down with mud, and the constant focus exhausted muscles and minds alike. The Americans began to notice details they had never paid attention to before: the angle of sunlight filtering through the canopy, the shape of a leaf indicating a possible animal trail, the subtle differences in footprints that could reveal whether someone had passed recently or days ago. By the end of the day, none of the Green Berets had been captured, but the lessons were already sinking in. The jungle was more than terrain. It was a living adversary. It demanded respect, awareness, and adaptability. The Americans realized that the British philosophy of jungle warfare was not about overwhelming force, but about understanding the environment and moving within it. That evening, the instructors gathered the patrol and debriefed them quietly. One of the SAS sergeants spoke without arrogance, but with quiet authority. "The jungle does not forgive mistakes. You are only as good as your awareness. You may have fought in Vietnam, but this forest is not the Mekong Delta. Respect it, read it, and move with it, or it will teach you lessons you cannot recover from." The Green Berets listened. They had seen firefights, ambushes, and sniper attacks, but nothing had tested their patience and focus like the jungle itself. Over time, the soldiers began to adopt a new mindset. They started thinking in terms of observation and anticipation rather than reaction. They learned to notice the subtle cues that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. During the following exercises, the Americans began to outperform expectations. They were faster, quieter, and more observant. A soldier might spot a small footprint and deduce whether it belonged to a man or an animal, how long ago it had been made, and in which direction the subject was moving. They moved silently through vines and roots that had once seemed impassable, adapting to the rhythm of the forest. At night, the SAS instructors introduced another critical skill: silent communication. Soldiers learned to signal with subtle gestures, shadows, and positions without speaking. Every sound had to be calculated. Even breathing could betray a position if it was not controlled. By the end of the week, the Americans were no longer just students. They had begun to think like the British instructors. The lessons extended beyond movement or tracking. They involved mindset, discipline, and understanding the jungle as a living battlefield. They realized that success in the forest depended not on firepower, but on patience, observation, and mental resilience. Several of the Green Berets later remarked that it was during this stage that their respect for the SAS truly solidified. They had entered the course confident in their skills, expecting to teach or judge. Instead, they were humbled, pushed, and transformed. They had discovered that the jungle would always have the upper hand until a soldier learned to anticipate it. The final challenge of the week was a multi-day field exercise combining everything learned so far: navigation, observation, stealth, and extraction. Each soldier had to patrol, avoid detection, gather intelligence, and return safely without relying on radios, helicopters, or outside support. Exhaustion became a constant companion, but the lessons were immediate and unforgettable. By the time the exercise concluded, the Green Berets had begun to internalize the British way. The jungle was an equal partner in warfare. Respect it, understand it, move with it, and it would reveal the enemy. Underestimate it, and it would betray you. They left the field with a new perspective, knowing that every detail counted, every movement had a consequence, and survival depended more than training. It depended on thinking like the environment itself. The Americans were no longer just soldiers entering a foreign course. They were students of the jungle, apprentices to a philosophy honed over decades of real conflict. The transformation was subtle but profound, and by this point in their 6-week course, it was already changing the way they thought about war, patience, and the meaning of being truly invisible in a hostile environment. By the final week of their course, the 12 American Green Berets had changed in ways that none of them had expected. The initial confidence they had brought from Vietnam had been tempered by the quiet, relentless discipline of the SAS instructors. They no longer thought of jungle warfare as merely movement through trees or firefights. They understood it as a system, a mental and physical language spoken by the forest itself. The last exercises combined everything they had learned: long-range patrols, stealth observation, tracking, navigation, and survival. The Americans moved in small teams through dense rainforest, establishing hidden positions, reading subtle signs, and avoiding detection entirely. At night, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds that once went unnoticed. Every insect, every rustle of leaves, every distant footstep could carry meaning. By now, the soldiers could interpret these signals with increasing accuracy. During one exercise, the Americans had to follow a mock enemy trail for nearly 30 kilometers without leaving evidence of their own passage. They were forced to plan every step carefully, choosing routes that minimized disturbance to the forest floor and timing movements to coincide with wind, animal activity, and natural cover. They learned to recognize patterns that would have gone unnoticed to untrained eyes, the way a bent leaf suggested recent passage, or how mud clung differently to a boot depending on the soil's moisture. The SAS instructors watched silently, intervening only to correct mistakes or offer brief lessons. The Americans began to notice subtle techniques that distinguished the British approach from their own training, moving with patience, blending into the environment completely, and never relying on external support. In Vietnam, firepower and technology often dictated success. Here, the jungle dictated every decision. By the last day, the Green Berets were tasked with a complex field exercise to infiltrate a mock enemy camp, observe it, report intelligence, and extract without being detected. They moved like shadows through the rainforest, stepping over roots, crouching beneath branches, and pausing for long minutes to listen and watch. It was exhausting, mentally and physically, but it was the culmination of everything they had learned. After successfully completing the exercise, the Americans gathered around the instructors. There were no medals, no ceremonies, only quiet acknowledgement. One of the SAS sergeants spoke directly to the group. "You've learned to move through the jungle without it moving you. That is all the training we can give. Everything else depends on your judgment, your patience, and your respect for what you cannot control." The Green Berets knew that the lessons would follow them back to Vietnam. They had experienced firsthand how stealth, patience, and observation could turn the forest into an ally rather than a threat. They had learned to read the jungle as the enemy had, and in doing so, they had discovered the limits of conventional tactics and the importance of thinking beyond firepower. On their final day, as they loaded their gear onto the Bedford truck for the drive back to Singapore, the Americans reflected quietly on what they had learned. Some joked about how much the British instructors had humbled them, but behind the humor was a deeper recognition. The jungle had taught lessons that no textbook or conventional mission could provide. Back at RAF Changi before boarding the transport aircraft to return to Vietnam, the Green Berets exchanged quiet words about the course. One of them said, "We thought we were going to teach them something. Turns out, we just learned how to disappear." The experience would resonate for years. In subsequent deployments, the techniques they had learned, movement with stealth, patient observation, environmental awareness, and subtlety, would inform their decisions in ways that saved lives and shaped operations. The SAS philosophy had shown them that mastery of the jungle was as much about mental discipline as physical endurance. For the 12 Green Berets, the Far East Land Forces Jungle Warfare School was not a diplomatic courtesy or a simple training exercise. It was a transformation, a lesson in humility and skill that redefined how they understood jungle warfare. They returned to Vietnam not just as soldiers, but as men who had learned to listen to the forest, to move with it, and above all, to respect it. By the time the transport wheels lifted off the tarmac, the Americans were no longer the same men who had arrived in Singapore weeks earlier. The jungle had left its mark, invisible but indelible, shaping the way they would fight, survive, and lead for the rest of their careers.